Thank you all for joining us. And I guess let's jump right in. I always say behind every well-crafted bio is an even better origin story. So I would love to hear how each of you got into the field and how you got in your current role, and maybe tell us a little bit more about what you're doing day to day. We'll start with you, Orleana.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me, Alexandra, and everyone else. It's good to see you this evening. So my story is an interesting one. I'm actually a recovering engineer, and I'm teasing. It is fantastic and a great foundation for what I do as a marketer. But I was an industrial engineer and a practicing engineer in the world of consulting when I decided to change, make a little bit of a pivot. And I went to business school to study marketing and international business. That was over 20 years ago. But I will tell you, at the time of doing that, I realized I had always loved advertising. I had always had an affinity for advertising. I had a favorite commercial at all times from my teenage years and beyond. So I realized there was something about the way a brand or a company spoke to consumers that always fascinated me. And my pivot actually came from a particular campaign that the Gap did in the early 90s. And it was the first time that I was conscious of how Black people were portrayed elegantly in the most funky and modern way. And it was actually a campaign called Fall Into the Gap. And it featured a number of celebrities that I was a fan of, but it was the way that they did it. And for those listening and watching, check out Fall Into the Gap from early 90s, and you'll see something interesting in that. And that inspired me to look into going into marketing and advertising. And then I ended up, I would say, my true break, really when I started to do and felt like I could call myself a marketer, was when I ended up in the cable television industry. So post-graduate school, I worked in a number of fields that I would call adjacent to marketing. They were either in sales and marketing, or people were leveraging my past engineering and consulting background. But in the cable industry, I started to work directly in digital media. And that was over 15 years ago. And since then, I have done everything from consumer marketing to grassroots marketing to running a digital media department. And then getting into what I do now, which was joining a partner who's in the same field and starting our own, really building our own business. And currently, as president and COO of Joy Collective, we're a social impact creative agency. And so we work with brands to help them find the nexus of business and society. And that's 26 years in as short as I can do it.
Well, I already have more questions. We'll get to those as we dig into some of our other topics. Shannon, how about you? What's the story behind the bio?
So I got started in advertising about a decade ago. And I actually got my start sort of by way of the film industry. I had always known that I wanted to be in a creative field, but my first love was cinema and film. So after college, I got a job at WME in LA, and I worked as an agent's assistant for about a year, and then spent a few years working on the indie film side of the film industry, doing some script development and trying to help my boss wrangle funding during the recession for these very small, really cool projects. And a couple of them actually went, but I think that experience sort of taught me that I loved creative work, but the film industry wasn't a great fit for me. So I thought of other industries where I might be able to apply the skills I learned and the passion that I had. And then advertising sort of popped onto my radar, and I learned more about it, and it seemed like a pretty perfect fit. So I signed up for portfolio schools, a portfolio school called Miami Ad School. And portfolio schools, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like a sort of a almost like a trade school for people who wanted to go into the creative side of the ad industry. And a year and a half later, after leaving the film industry, I was a copywriter at Y&R Chicago. And I got that job because of that portfolio program. I couldn't have gotten my start when I did without Miami Ad School. So that was a big pivot in my life, and I'm really grateful for that program. It's also how I met my fiance on a personal note. So I have a lot of love for that school. And yeah, so I've been in the ad industry for, like I said, about a decade, hopping from agency to agency. Did a short stint in Mumbai at BBH India as an internship through Miami Ad School, and then got my first job, like I said, at Y&R in Chicago. And then moved to Strawberry Frog in New York for a short stint, then got a job at Ogilvy on a big account on IBM, which was really fun. Stayed there for a few years working on multiple accounts, and then got the job that I have now at Chiat New York, and have been at Chiat for a few years and worked on Stop the Spread and a number of other cause-related campaigns. And it's been very interesting working on cause-related work at an ad agency, because you've got your huge clients that are sort of more traditional, and that the accounts are typically really huge. But everybody always wants to work on cause work at some point, because it's mission driven, and I think at the end of the day, we all want to use our creativity to make the world a better place in some way or another. So it's always such a treat to be able to apply what we know and what we do, and use our time for cause related campaigns. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's how I got where I am.
Thank you. My theory is that social impact communication professionals, due to the sort of the diverse backgrounds that they typically come from, tend to demand greater satisfaction from their careers, and that's kind of what drives us. So far, I'm 2 for 2. Let's see if Kieran also supports the theory. Kieran, tell us your story.
Sure. Well, thank you, Alexandra, for moderating, and thanks to Max and everyone at the Center for Communication for having us. This is a really important discussion, so I'm really honored to be here. My story is that growing up, I was always interested in media and politics. And when I was in college, I was majoring in public policy, and I was working at the student newspaper to explore the world of journalism. And the summer between my junior and senior year, I got an internship on the 2012 Obama campaign to see what the whole political world was about. And I ended up taking the fall semester of my senior year off to work through the election, because I wanted to see things through. And we ended up winning the election, and that sort of cemented the choice to go into politics. So after graduating school, I got involved in a startup consulting firm called Precision Strategies that sort of came out of the Obama campaign and sought to use the winning approach that we'd used in 2012, centering communications around digital strategy and trying to run a integrated campaign that especially relied on analytics, and take that approach to helping clients run their own strategic campaigns, whether they were trying to win elections or grow their businesses or reach new audiences. So I worked there for 3 years, and it was great because I got exposure to a really broad array of industries across corporate, nonprofit, political, government sectors. But my heart still lay in progressive politics. And so in 2016, I got involved in the Clinton campaign, working as a speechwriter and a communications advisor. Obviously, the Clinton campaign didn't go exactly the way the Obama campaign did. So I've known both the thrills of victory and the anguish of defeat close up. After 2016, I was thinking about getting involved in another progressive campaign or joining, the resistance, quote unquote, in some respect. But I was also troubled by this larger issue of political polarization and just the basic breakdown in social trust and the trust that Americans have in institutions and in each other. And I saw this as sort of a deeper issue that transcends various political debates. And it was then that I helped start an organization. At the time, we were called Better Angels, named after Abraham Lincoln's quote, "The better angels of our nature." And the idea was to see if we could use family therapy practices to help liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, talk to one another in a constructive manner, not necessarily to try to find common ground or agreement, but to better understand each other beyond stereotypes and start to build the trust that you need to actually work together where you do agree. So that was in 2017. And since then, we've grown into a nationwide citizens movement of reds and blues, conservatives and liberals, everything in between, people of goodwill who don't necessarily agree on policy, but do agree that something's broken in this country when it comes down to the basic way we treat each other in politics. And we hope to use media, programming, grassroots organizing to try to illuminate a new way and build a new path forward that kind of calls on us to be our best selves and to try to make progress.
And the need has certainly grown since 2017. I'm sure the work is getting harder. So thinking, you each represents very different points of view. We've got sort of the strategic partner, boutique type of agency approach, working closely with brands. We have the bigger agency approach, and we've got a nonprofit. As we said, most of our audience tends to be students, and I'd love for them to get a sense of the work. So if I could have maybe each of you talk a little bit about where you begin, what's sort of your process? Maybe let's start with Shannon.
Sure. So at an ad agency, typically the way we work for creatives, our work starts with getting briefed. A creative brief is written by a group of strategists that also work at the company. We have a strategy department, and their job is to research, find insights about audiences, work with each client to develop a set of goals, figure out a point of view that the brand should have. And they craft a brief that's typically not brief. It's called a brief, but they're usually quite long. And it's just as much information as possible on the company, on the problem they're trying to solve, on what they need us to make. And then they, sort of try to crystallize the main points, the big takeaways, of what do we want people to feel? What do we need to make? And what do we want people to do in response? Like, what's the call to action? So the strategists work on that brief for usually a few weeks. And then they bring it to us as creatives. They brief us on it, and then we have never enough time to come up with ideas. We always want more time, but it's usually, it could be a week, it could be 2 weeks to develop creative, check in with any creative directors, executive creative directors, our chief creative officer, whoever is sort of overseeing the project. We kind of run the ideas up the ladder, pressure test them, talk to our strategists about them, make sure that they're on strategy, but that they're simple, entertaining, emotional, make people feel something, because if it makes people feel something, then people will remember it. And that's kind of how our process works. Although that sounds incredibly simplified, it's usually a lot of rounds, a lot of brainstorming, the way that creative departments or that creatives typically work in teams. So I'm a writer, my background is writing, and I will typically work with an art director partner, and we'll bounce ideas off of each other. Anything from, script ideas for a film, if there's a need for a film, if there's a need to create some sort of experience, maybe it's like an outdoor exhibit that people can interact with. We'll think of that. out of home ideas, as was the case with the Stop the Spread campaign. And we'll sometimes also work with designers who have more of a specialty in visualizing ideas. They'll have specific ideas about, colors and fonts, and can just bring ideas to life in a way that really elevates them and makes them even more powerful. And then after ideas get approved, we'll partner with, if it's a film, we'll partner with a production company and a director, or if it's an exhibit, we'll partner with a production company that can make whatever we need to make. And then we put it out in the world, and that's kind of what our process is like. But it really differs from project to project. And the great thing about advertising now is really like anything can be content. The sky's sort of the limit, and creativity can really, it can take you to such interesting places. So, we make all kinds of things, from traditional out of home to films, to I worked on a cause related campaign a few years ago, and what we were making was a box of chocolates, not a traditional ad at all, but still very effective and really, I think the goal is really to surprise people and push the boundaries of creativity, because that's when your message gets really interesting. So that's sort of what our process is like at an ad agency.
Thank you. And how about you, Orleana, at the Joy Collective? Who are some of the key players, and sort of what is your process and timing from inception to launch?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I really appreciate what Shannon said, because the creative process is very much a part of what we do, but we are a full service agency. And that means we do everything from actually primary research. We conduct the research on behalf of clients. So what you heard Shannon describe in terms of really understanding a consumer and what a company and a brand are trying to connect to in terms of building a relationship with a consumer. We do all of that, and insights and strategy, which is helping them understand how to approach that consumer. And then all the way from the creative development. So we do video production, we do, anything from art direction, creative and graphic design, but we go all the way to experiential. So we do events, event production, PR, and all of that. So for us, I think it always starts with research and insights. And I think that's consistent with a lot of agencies. You'll see what is unique about Joy Collective is that, one, we are a women-owned, Black-owned firm, and we serve companies in helping them understand, diverse consumers and diverse consumer sets. And we are known for the work that we do with Black consumers, in reaching Black consumers and with the Black community. And I think what's really unique about what we do is it's not a transaction, in that we don't have brands or companies that come to us and say, hey, we want to market this product to, to a particular consumer. We want to reach Black women more effectively. We have brands whose purpose and mission as a brand we need to understand, relate to, and align with, and we have to believe in what they believe in. And a great example is Dove. We've been working with the Dove brand. Most people know Dove soap and personal care products, and we've been working with them for 3 years. And Dove is a brand that believes that a positive experience of beauty should be accessible to all women and girls. That affects self-esteem, affects a number of different things, body confidence. But in the Black community, beauty is experienced differently. And it hasn't always been a positive experience of beauty, because of the narrative around beauty being a very narrow picture and perception of beauty. So Dove asked us, how do we create more of a connection and relationship with Black women, and how do we help create a more positive experience of beauty for Black women? That's where a firm like Joy Collectives comes in. So we help them understand what the experience of beauty is for Black women and girls. And then even from doing the research, there's a research study that we conducted for them. But for the past 3 years, we actually have taken on advancing legislation. So we've actually gotten into the policy space, and we recognize that, you know, a particular issue or pain point for Black women, which is hair discrimination, is really a civil rights issue. Now, why would you have a brand or a company come into and have a marketing conversation about it? That's because there's a need to build awareness for the bias that's behind that particular pain point for that consumer. So that's a lot of the research and insights we do. And then a lot of the work goes to community engagement, civic engagement, and then a lot of the creative development that Shannon talked about, we do as well. But for us, an engagement that is really a social impact initiative or campaign is something that is for the long haul. And it starts with really understanding purpose and what that company or brand intends to do for the greater good, not just to build a relationship so a consumer understands or is interested in purchasing their products.
Definitely. You touched on something I want to come back to about sort of what is driving this in terms of the change and demands among consumers that's changing. So I want to come back to that. But Kieran, tell us a little bit about your process, because you're working in a completely different type of environment, and your deliverable is more programming versus traditional campaigns. So talk about the process at Braver Angels.
Sure. Well, I'll talk a little bit about the organization and then my role specifically. I think Braver Angels is unique in that we're really a bottom-up grassroots organization. So we have a relatively small, paid staff, but we have thousands of volunteers across the country. And so our model is really decentralized. It's about developing programming that people in communities across the country can take into their communities and bring people in. And so we've been working on expanding our offerings. So we originally had just a red-blue workshop. That's 8 liberals, 8 conservatives come together for a day of exercises. But we've expanded it to do debates on college campuses. We've launched our own media network to sort of model what more constructive cross-partisan discourse could look like in the media space. And we also really want to reflect the country that we're trying to serve. So we don't want it to just be, moderates, center right and center left, people who already agree. We really want to reach the communities who are most polarized and most mistrustful of the system, whether it's Tea Party Trump supporters on the right or social justice activists on the left. And so it's kind of an interesting messaging challenge because you're speaking to audiences who are very ideologically opposed, but sort of united in their disaffection. And so thinking through ways to reach people where they are and really speak to the pain points that are motivating their anger and activism, and try to bring them into a conversation where people don't feel like they have to compromise their values in order to have the conversation. Because that's one of the big problems we have now, is that our politics are so intertwined with our identity that people sometimes feel like even engaging with another perspective is akin to surrendering their own perspective, when in fact it actually often can empower you to reach people who might not agree with you. So it's definitely a difficult process in 2021. And last year was obviously a very painful and divisive year. But for us, it kind of helped us grow because we had a lot of people who were isolated at home with not much else to do besides freak out over politics. And so we had a bit of a captive audience, and we brought all of our programming on Zoom, and we were able to really grow our audience. In terms of my role as the chief marketing officer, I guess I would kind of divide it into marketing, messaging, and digital. Marketing, it's sort of a core growth challenge. We're a membership organization, so people want to support us, they become members, they pay dues. Our dues are only $1 a month because we want it to be open to everyone. And the question is, how do you scale? How do you put out messages that are both tailored to audiences, but also accessible to broad audiences? And how do you make decisions that are based on analytics, not just based on, what your gut might tell you? From the messaging perspective, a lot of what I do is putting out our own public argument about why this is important. So we have a podcast, we make videos, we're constantly trying to make social media content. And from the digital side of things, it's how do you make content that's not only compelling, but is also digestible and shareable, particularly when you're trying to reach a younger audience whose attention span might not be the same as an older audience. And so at my organization, we all wear many hats, but everyone's sort of united by the fact that they believe in the mission, because in some ways our product is our culture. And so maintaining that culture is really doing internally what we're trying to help the country do. And as you grow as an organization, there can be a tension between culture and structure. And I think that's something we're really focused on in 2021 is finding that balance.
Yeah, I mean, you're all touching on the importance of audience insights is kind of the beginning of all of this, right? Connecting meaningfully, whether it's people's, the barriers that are preventing people from connecting, or, other challenges that just allow you to tailor the messaging in a more meaningful way. So I would love, maybe Orleana, if you could go back to something you said earlier and talk a little bit more about consumers, right? We've seen this evolution in the comms and marketing space, from cause to social impact to now purpose-driven organizations. What is it about audiences that you think is making social impact communication so important, and what is the benefit to brands?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I have to lean into this one because I think the audience here being students, and I'm going to admit, I graduated from college in 1994, and I have a son going to college this year. And there's something obviously, like blatantly different from a generational perspective. It's not to say that we, and my generation as a Gen Xer, weren't socially conscious. I think there's a different level of social consciousness today. And I just love that, Gen Z audience in particular, folks who are in college now, like the students we're talking to, because I think social media, the advent of social media over the last 10 to 15 years, just in terms of what it has done in opening up telecommunications globally, we see more, we're exposed to more. So it's not to say that in, the last 100 years, you haven't had socially conscious generations, but we see something different. So even the numbers, I think the last research I saw said that 60% of consumers are expecting the brands and the companies they purchase products from to be very clear that they stand for something, right? To take a stand, and because especially when it comes to social justice. And when we look at the Gen Z generation, millennials alone, which is just a little bit older, right? Most diverse. So Gen Z, absolutely most diverse generation that we have. So there's a cultural, there's an ethnic, there's a sexual, there's a fluidity that we haven't seen, and a different level of acceptance, not tolerance, but acceptance. So I think now we are looking at a newer generation that has not expectations, but requirements from the companies that serve them and serve us as a community in a capitalist society. And so I think we have to be really conscious of understanding what those expectations are, meeting those consumers where they are. So I don't think a brand or a company, a business, a brand, I don't think you can afford to not have purpose at this point, or be clear about what yours is. If your purpose is just revenue generating and just to make money, then you be clear about that and make sure you're in the right space and serving the right consumers who actually appreciate that. But I think, we can no longer do business as advertisers and marketers without being clear about where we stand and what we stand for. And the consumer audience is demanding that. And you can see over the last year, for a company like Joy Collective that spends a lot of our time helping companies connect to, Black consumers and the African American consumer audience over the past year. You've got so many companies that recognize that diversity and inclusion has been a checkbox in their advertising and marketing. It hasn't actually been something that they've operationalized effectively, which I think, at this point, what value does it add for brands? One, it helps you build what I talked about earlier, which is building a relationship with consumers rather than transacting. Somebody might buy your product today, but as many messages as there are in the marketplace, they will buy somebody else's tomorrow. If you want a relationship with consumers, one that consumer will be an ambassador for you, an influencer for you, then you definitely need to be focused on how purpose drives what you do.
Absolutely, audiences demand it. How about you, Shannon? Thoughts on, you've worked with a variety of brands. What specifically, what is the value to brands in taking a stand on some of these issues, as Orleana mentioned?
So I think everything Orleana mentioned is so relevant and true. And I think if I were to add anything to that, I would just say I think it's not. It doesn't just stop as proclaiming that you have values. It's actually living the values, which is, I think, where a lot of companies, especially huge companies, stumble, is they profess these values and then don't actually live up to them. And I think that's sort of something that requires clients to do quite a lot of work. You can say you stand for something, but to actually stand for it in the way you do business, in the way you treat your own employees, and it takes quite a lot of consistent effort. So I think it can't just be a marketing strategy. I think that's going to alienate consumers, and I'm sure Orleana agrees with this. That will alienate consumers even more than standing for nothing at all. You have to actually walk the walk. So that's, or I think the consequences of not could just be catastrophic.
I mean, we've seen the cultural shift where, younger audiences are holding companies accountable, right? That's the power of social media. There's a transparency
Absolutely
that allows people to see who's following through. Shifting gears a little bit, Kieran, you're dealing with communication and changing minds, essentially, right? Not bringing awareness to an issue or taking a stand, but trying to bring people to getting over barriers. So can you talk about what in your experience has worked? I mean, what are some strategies that work when we're talking about changing attitudes and behaviors in some cases?
Sure. Well, I think one of the issues with polarization now is that we no longer see our, political opponents as simply wrong or misguided, but we see them as fundamentally bad people, evil people, enemies, people who need to be defeated. That's a lot of the language that you hear. And so there's a lot of zero-sum rhetoric that can really morph into contempt, sort of the belief that my opponent is worthless. And that kind of language can morph into violent action, as we've seen. And so we are really trying to push the idea that there's an alternative, which is conversation. But it's not the conversation where it's like, let's get everyone together to show how we all agree and how we're all united, because we're not united. There are deep disagreements in this country. And so I think for us, we focus a lot on not just empathy and compassion and respect, which are all very important, but also courage, the courage to face conflict, to try to acknowledge the differences that do exist, but then transform conflict into sort of like a higher synthesis. And we found that what's most important for doing that is the structure of the conversation and the container for doing it. Because people have been so conditioned to see political conversations as kind of like a, dominate or submit. How can I humiliate my opponent, especially if it's on social media? And your audience, of course, is your own tribe. You're trying to show your own tribe that you're enforcing orthodoxy. in a lot of cases, rather than actually, pushing your agenda forward. And we've found that if we can reframe a debate into an opportunity to make your voice heard and better understand where someone else is coming from, you can actually change minds more effectively, provided that people are coming in good faith and not trying to use the debate in a cynical way, to silence people, or push people away from the table. So it takes a lot of courage to do that, not only to, absorb the insults and name calling that you're going to get from people who disagree with you, but also to withstand the judgment that you're going to get from your friends who are going to accuse you of, being a sellout. And so we find that there's a lot of appetite for our work. And when you can build the right structure, people are really hungry for it, because it feels good to find understanding with people who are different from you, versus just, staying at home and kind of consumed by this sort of gnawing anger and helplessness that we have when we're watching the news and seeing things that outrage us. So it's very much a marketing challenge. We want to get people into the room, because we have faith in our methods. We know they work. And so now the question is, how can we scale our organization to the point that we can actually meaningfully change institutions and start to change norms in our political culture that will change incentives that drive behavior from politicians? And then how do we engage politicians to model those norms that can then inspire the grassroots and try to create sort of a virtuous cycle rather than the vicious cycle we've all been swirling down over the past, 1, 5, 10 years.
Which we should all be tired of, right? At this point, we should all be begging to come to all of your programs, given the last, few years we've had. I'll pose the same question to you, Shannon. I mean, tell us a little bit more about the Stop the Spread campaign. It's not necessarily it's a combination of barriers there. You've got some fear, you've got some misinformation, and how do you get your message across? What strategies work to really get people to act in this case?
So I think for us, we were briefed on that project last May when there was, it's just crazy how much things were changing by the week back then. Nobody knew what was going on. I think at that point, I remember, there was like a thought that, well, hey, like the quarantine might be lifted relatively soon and we all might be back to work like shortly. We had no idea how long things were going to go on for or what to expect. But there was a general sense that if things did start to open up, as they seemed they were going to do at that time, that, obviously we were still in the midst of a pandemic and we needed to remind people that just because certain restrictions were easing, that didn't mean that they should stop taking a pandemic seriously. And at the time, there was a lot of mixed messages coming from the White House, to say the least. There was a lot of misinformation and a lot of doubt. And so I think what our job was to present information that were clearly facts that you couldn't argue with, simple safety tips, in a way that was entertaining and engaging and bright and beautiful, to just remind people in an entertaining yet serious way, to continue to sort of respect the CDC recommendations for washing your hands, staying 6 feet apart, wearing a mask, no hugging, things like that. Like these kind of, again, simple tips that you can't argue with that. So I think that was sort of that was working in our favor, was the messages that we had to convey were so clearly kind of common sense. that it made our job easy. All we had to do was simply communicate them in a way that was visually interesting, which is where our design department stepped in and really did so much of the heavy lifting here. I wish they were here to talk about this with me. They just executed these safety tips in the most beautiful way to really make them eye-catching and cool and interesting to look at. Which does quite a lot. It's so much more engaging if you just have a sign that says wash your hands, but if it's beautifully designed, then it's something that you want to stare at, which can make a huge difference. So the Stop the Spread campaign was I would say it was not as challenging to convince people of our message. It didn't take that much effort, I think, to sort of spread these tips. But I think had we editorialized or sort of clouded the message with anything that seemed laden with agenda, then it would have been a different story. So our job in that case was relatively easy, I would say. Yeah.
And Orleana, you talked a little bit about the importance of primary research in your process, really being full service, but starting there to help clients come up with the right approach. Having gone through that process with numerous clients, are there some general things you can say about what really works or how to approach pulling insights out of the research to really develop impactful campaigns?
Yeah, I think this is a place where representation is really important, making sure that you have the right folks at the table to interpret that data, because there are a lot of companies that invest in research, but understanding why people do what they do. The research tells you what they do. It doesn't always tell you why they do it. So having somebody who can do that interpretation that really gets behind the lifestyle, value, and behavior of that consumer is really important. And I love this conversation because just listening to, what my fellow panelists are saying in terms of Stop the Spread and the other campaigns, we've been working on the COVID vaccine education campaign. We are the agency that's helping lead a lot of the work, leading all the work, I beg your pardon, for outreach to the Black community to build awareness for and get the facts for the COVID-19 vaccine. It's a massive national campaign I'm sure people have seen all over the place, but research and insights so important up front. And in working with the Ad Council and COVID Collaborative, they were so committed to understanding where that hesitancy comes from, why people are afraid to take the vaccine. And so understanding that there's historical perspective that informs people's distrust of taking certain action or making certain decisions as consumers, as individuals or citizens is really, really important. And that's something that we were able to lend some work to and some brain power to, is really being able to break down that data and break down even the insights to the point of how do you then address how you communicate to someone if you're really looking to, change a mindset in many respects. That's what many of us are doing as marketers, right? We are either trying to cement a mindset or we're trying to shift one. And so you have to understand the baseline first. So I think that's, just having the right people at the table to be able to interpret why behind the what is really important.
Okay. I want to get to two last things before we move into our Q&A, because I know we've got, you guys are inspiring our audience right now. And given your journeys, I thought we would ask each of you to maybe share a little bit on how people can break into this field. You all entered social impact and sort of messaging for the public interest in very different ways. What advice would each of you give to people trying to just get started? We'll start with Orleana and then Shannon and then Kieran.
Sure. The first thing I would say is at least understand all of the different functions or disciplines within advertising and marketing. I will say if you are interested in content and video production, you could be on the graphic design side and creative services side there. You might be a market researcher, or want to be a market researcher, or want to do event production. There's so many things that you can do to contribute to the process that actually delivers that messaging and marketing to the world. So I would advise, first explore the areas that you really connect with, that are of interest to you, and look for opportunities in those areas. The other thing I would say around purpose-driven work, because that's the essence of our conversation, is look at companies that you admire and what they stand for, where your personal purpose, and your personal sort of conviction is aligned with that company. And be willing to try different things and see if you can get your foot in the door. Find who you might know that can give you a leg up with that company. Because I think when you really do find working with a business or a company whose values align directly with yours, it is more likely you will enjoy what you do. It is more likely you're willing to stay in that environment. And it's more likely that the company actually has other people working there, or you'll be, in a community, business community of other folks. I'm not saying like-minded, because like-minded is not the same, but shared purpose and value, I do think is important. And I would advise taking that step.
And I would add that you'll be better at your job, right? We all work better at things that we love.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Great advice. How about you, Shannon?
So that was all beautifully stated, 100% what Orleana said. I think that's great. I would also suggest after you have done that, after you've explored all of the different types of paths that are possible to go down, because there are so many, start reaching out, like on LinkedIn or whatever way is most convenient to you. I find LinkedIn is just a great way to connect with people. But just start connecting with people at the types of agencies you'd like to work at. Be persistent, ask them questions about how they do what they do, how they got started, try to make connections that way. As I said, the way that I got into advertising was through ad school. So I think there's quite a lot of conversation going on in the ad industry now about how ad school is both a pipeline and a barrier into creative departments, because in some ways it's given people a start, and in other ways it's money and it's time, and it's not everybody has the ability or the desire to go back to school and make a pretty hefty investment in order to switch industries. So I think that it's on the ad industry, particularly on creative departments, to make sure we're creating new pathways and new pipelines to get talent into the industry. And I know that there have been this year several programs that have opened up. Some have been started by individual agencies, like Chiat started one. I was a part of the group that created a new pipeline into the agency. Our Young Bloods program is bringing new talent into the creative department, sort of circumventing the traditional ad school route, just taking students from state schools and universities, state universities, and creating a pathway to get them into creative departments. And I know several other agencies, at least in New York, have done that. And then there are some independent programs that are creating pipelines for aspiring creatives. But I do think that getting your start in the world of advertising, particularly for creatives, has not been inclusive in the past decade, and it's sort of on the ad industry to change that. And it seems to be starting to change, but of course there's much work to be done. So again, use LinkedIn, try to find people who are advocating for change. They will reach out to me. Yeah, I'll do everything I can to give you advice, and hopefully they will too. But there are certainly people in the ad industry who would welcome your interest and answer all your questions. So try to make as many connections as you can.
And I'll add, I think that is one good byproduct of the pandemic. I think people have been much more open on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
willing to connect with strangers, and just generally more charitable with that kind of help. So definitely utilize that channel. How about you, Karen?
Yeah, well, first I would just echo pretty much everything Shannon and Orleana said. I think shared purpose and shared belief in a mission is usually going to serve you well and make you enjoy your job and feel like you're pushing the ball forward every day. So you have a reason to want to get out of bed. I would say if you're interested in getting involved in politics, there's no better way to just than join a political campaign. Doesn't have to be a national campaign or a Senate race, even if it's your local city council member. 'Cause the first thing it'll do is it'll show you pretty quick whether you actually think it's what you want to do. It can be grueling, but if you're a young person, you're not yet raising a family. There's a lot of mobility and fluidity within political campaigns. I don't think they're necessarily as hierarchical or structured as a lot of other businesses. And so a lot of times if you jump on a campaign and find your niche and you're really good at something, within 6 months, you could be just advancing in leadership, particularly when it comes to digital stuff. Campaigns are looking for college students and young people who are native on social media, TikTok, etc. They don't want people my age and older. So I think really leverage your creativity and your energy. And I think a political campaign, it's a lot of fun. There's ups and downs. It's kind of a crazy sprint to the finish. And then you either win or lose and it's over. And so a lot of highs and lows, but working, with that common purpose and in some ways uncommon sacrifice, you'll get really close to the people that you work with. And you'll also make connections and friendships that then can serve you when the campaign's over. If the candidate wins, then it's a lot easier to, pursue a job in government. And if the campaign loses, it can be really tough because then you kind of have to find a new job. But there are lots of ways that you can then leverage your experience in campaigns to get a job at an agency or a consulting firm. And so I would say just check out a local campaign. And I mean, if you have time, you can even just start volunteering, 5 hours a week at a campaign to see if you like it before, trying to pursue an internship or a staff position.
Yes, most campaigns would be hard pressed to turn down a talented, enthusiastic volunteer. So that is great advice. Okay, well, thank you to the panelists. It is now time to take our audience's questions. So who do we have first?
What qualities do you look for in young candidates, and what makes a young professional stand out?
Orleana, how about you take that?
I love that question. I'm a big fan of attitude as much as I am aptitude. And, one can see from your academic accomplishments what you're capable of. I want smart people who, will learn quickly. But there's something that when I was coming out of business school, the company that one of the executives that hired me, she used this term, fire in the belly. And I love that term. We may say sometimes another way to describe it is you have to be hungry. And it just means you're willing to get the job done and you're willing to put in the work. And I'll be honest, as we were talking earlier, I realized there's something that we may not have clarified, I think, as a group, and I certainly didn't, which is in advertising and marketing, there's so many different opportunities, but and Shannon and I come from the agency side and Kieran obviously coming from the nonprofit side, but understand that the agency life is professional services and the hours can be like investment banking and consulting. It's intense and you have to opt into that life. If you want to work on what we call the client side, then you may go work for a big company. It might be a consumer products company. It might be, a manufacturing company, and they have a big advertising and marketing department. And that's what we call being on the client side. And you go hire agencies like us. it's important to know where you want to sit in that environment and explore those, because the life is very, very different. I just wanted to make sure that I punctuated this conversation with that, because it's important to know what you're getting into as you're exploring this life in marketing and advertising. So just wanted to leave you on that.
And that's part of the fire that you're looking for, right? This person knows what they are getting into and they are passionate
Yes.
about everything that comes with it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So a lot of times when things don't work out, you think you found the perfect candidate and you find somebody who's smart and they've done well and they believe in what you believe in, but when they get there, their expectations are very different. So yeah, I appreciate you punctuating that point, Alexandra, because it is that hunger and that willingness to work hard, but also having very clear expectations and being willing to get into the life and the lifestyle that goes with the work.
Hi, my name is Philip Chang. I'm a senior at Boston University School of Communications. And this question was for Shannon Murphy or anyone that went to portfolio school. I was just wondering what kind of portfolio work that the school offered you. Was it more based on homework assignments, or did they connect you with real world clients and have that as like to build your portfolio?
Sure. So, hi, it's nice to meet you, first of all. And you said you were a senior, right?
Yes,
Okay, well,
considering
congratulations.
portfolio school.
You're almost there. So when I went to portfolio school, all the work we did was spec work. So you are, and it was a full-time program. So you'd go in, you would have a class on, say, copywriting 101. And you would, the instructor was typically a creative at a local ad agency. So I went to school in San Francisco, and one of my instructors worked at an agency called AKQA. So she would come in and she would say, okay, this week your client is NASCAR. Come up with a headline campaign. Write all of the best headlines you can about, why people should go watch NASCAR races. And we would go do that homework, do an 8-page brainstorm of all the different ways to write snappy, cool headlines about NASCAR. And then we would come back in, we would share our work, we would workshop it. She would take us through campaigns of the past, run us through what made them great, what made them memorable, what made them work, what made them not work. We would sort of study the greats, so to speak, and then try our luck at whatever exercises she would give us. And then we had obviously multiple classes in writing, art direction. There was even, I think there were some classes in video production. It was kind of a long time ago. It was like a decade ago. So I'm sure the curriculum has changed a lot. But at the end of each session or semester, we would typically have a bunch of spec campaigns. And by the time we were finished with the program, we could pick and choose from those spec campaigns which ones we thought were strongest, and those would go in our portfolio. 6 to 8 typically, I think, is the number, and we would use that spec work to get ourselves a job. So that was the sort of whole point of portfolio school, is to build a portfolio of spec work that shows how you think, and the fire in your belly, as Orleana was saying, and send that portfolio out to as many agencies as possible and land yourself a job as a junior creative.
Okay. And do the portfolio schools like have relationships with agencies that
They do.
they can kind of shoehorn you in?
Yes. So Miami Ad School is the only one I know well, but I'm pretty sure all of them have relationships with ad agencies that are either in the same region or in some cases around the world. And you can usually get an internship through the program. And I think those are certainly the best programs to get involved with, are the ones that offer that. So I would say if you are seriously considering portfolio school, you would definitely want to look into one that offers internships.
What's one thing you know now that you wish you knew when you were starting out in your career?
That's one that all of you could answer. We'll start with Kieran.
Sure. I guess it's hard when you're young to sort of set long-term or middle-term goals, but I think it can be a useful exercise. I felt like my career, I was just sort of kind of naturally bouncing from thing to thing, and it generally worked out well. But I think it can be an instructive exercise. Obviously, the path that you think about or multiple paths that you lay out are probably not going to be the path that you end up following. But I think going through that exercise and even just talking to your friends and your teachers and your parents or whoever, I think could be useful as you go along, as you sort of encounter new opportunities, new challenges, maybe even write it down and come back to it once a year. I think that's something, if I could go back in time, maybe I would have done, because I think it might help you feel sort of more confident and more anchored than if you're just sort of kind of making decisions based on what is available or what presents itself or what comes up.
Hi everyone, my name is Carson Lee from Columbia University. I'm a strategic communication student. So my question is, first, thank you so much. My question is, this is a tough year. I mean, shooting, racial justice, a lot of political divide. I'm wondering, how can companies create messages to avoid being tone deaf? I mean, this is a lot, we have a lot of emotions going on. It's really, so I'm wondering, what research did you have to do to sense people's emotional state and create a messaging that fits into that emotions? Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Carson. Lovely to see you. I'm going to throw that question to Orleana.
Carson, it's nice to meet you, and I thank you for that question as well. Quite an astute question. So what type of research do you have to do? One, you have to make sure that the very people, the community, the consumers that you're concerned with how they're thinking and feeling, that you actually have some direct experience with. And I will tell you, most for what's happening right now around social justice and racial equity, especially, a lot of the brands that we work with, a lot of the companies that we consult to, they come to us. I do a lot of go, no go sort of calls these days. And it's exactly what you described, Carson. It's having a pulse on what's happening. So social media is one of the key places where I think every advertiser and marketer right now is tracking what the conversation is, who's saying what, things are moving and changing by the minute. So I think being current in that respect is important. But the other thing is, if you're concerned about what's happening from a racial equity perspective, particularly with the Black community or the Asian American community right now, you better know in detail what's happening, who the most important voices are representing that community. So who in the ambassador and influencer space, celebrities, community leaders, who are they that are the trusted voices of that community, and really leaning into that. I think that's important as well. But that's how we advise brands. We make sure that we know and are part of that community inside and out. And we tell them, what, really just advising them what to say, what not to say, and how to make sure that you don't appear to be performative and opportunistic. Just now we just had this happen actually last week with the verdict from the Derek Chauvin trial. And you have a lot of companies saying, do we say something? Do we not say something? Because a year ago we did, right? And the thing that we have to be careful of is we always advise them, don't just say something because you can, but if it aligns with who you are and commitments that you've made. I think Shannon said this in terms of you have to walk the walk, right? You have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And so you have to live up to who you are, your mission, and what commitments you've made. And that's really where we start.
And just one thing to quickly add on to that, I agree with all that. I think, it's also important to keep in mind that you can take a really strong stand for what you believe in without demonizing or dehumanizing people who don't see things the same way. Because I think there's always that temptation. It's sort of a lot easier to just jump on the criticism train rather than actually sort of casting a positive vision for the world that you want to see. And so that's something I would definitely counsel campaigns, causes, and companies to think about as they're trying to assess their own blind spots, which is very tricky to do.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This has been an incredible panel so far. I'm unable to turn my camera on, but I am here. My question is kind of relating to something you've all touched on a little bit already, which is just basically like Gen Z and how like our knowledge of social media and the internet world and how all of that works can really be like a great tool to help us like land a job or like really get in there. And so I was kind of wondering like what other qualities would like make a young professional like stand out, especially someone from Gen Z, and like if it is like really a lot of social media stuff, like how can we kind of, I guess, phrase that and use that to our advantage?
That is a great question. I'm going to add something to it for you, Lauren. Qualities, as well as just where do you see right now the best opportunities for Gen Z to get in this field and really enter and be visible in this field? Let's have everyone answer this. Let's start with Shannon.
Being your authentic self will always make you stand out. I think showing what you're truly passionate about, who you are as a person, what you care about, what you're drawn to, those I think are the qualities that from what I have seen and what I've experienced really make a person's sort of portfolio pop out when we're looking through websites at work for aspiring juniors. There really is nothing like your voice. Having a voice that sounds like you, that is a voice like no one else's. I think if that can kind of come across in your work and on your website or in your social posts or whatever, that I think goes a long way. Like I think I've heard people say that the most interesting part of a student portfolio or an aspiring junior's portfolio is the About Me page. That's where sort of you can let yourself out, where you can show people who you really are, what you care about. So it certainly, if you understand emerging technology, that's always going to be a great thing. But I also think there is always going to be tremendous value in knowing who you are and not being afraid to show it and bringing, as we say, sort of bringing your whole self to work. And it kind of goes back to something that Orleana was saying about finding a company that's a great fit for you, finding a place that will appreciate who you are and respect what you bring to the table. Those companies can be hard to find, and it can take time and energy to find them, but I think they are out there. So think about not simply, what companies are looking for in aspiring creatives or aspiring hires. What are you looking for in a company? That's equally important. When you go on a job interview, you are interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So it's not all up to them. You do have power, and you should, find a company like Orleana was saying, that you feel is a great fit for you too.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And I think it's a little bit of a tricky question too, because it's one that, I didn't really have to confront. I think the reality is there's a lot of pressure on social media to grow a following and become an influencer and have a personal brand. And I think the reality is that it can make you more hireable. A lot of companies in various industries, if somebody's already has their own audience and has already, demonstrated that they can reach an audience and they can connect with an audience, it's sort of an asset for the company to want to hire that person. And so I think if you're somebody who wants to create a personal brand and you feel like you can do that in a way that's authentic to you and true to your values, then I think you should lean into it. Because I think that really can be an asset, particularly when you're trying to go into creative strategy, social media, digital strategy. A lot of companies are trying to hire folks who can actually be, their boots on the ground on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. The flip side of that, though, is it's also kind of perverse incentives, because a lot of people feel like, well, I just need to focus on promoting myself. And the way to do that is to try to inhabit a persona that I don't actually embody. And so it's a tricky thing to navigate. How do you do that and be authentic to yourself? But I think just doing it intentionally and thoughtfully and keeping in mind the sort of reality of where we are is important. So hopefully that's some helpful context.
Thank you, Kieran. Orleana, you get the last word.
Oh, yay. I love this question. And I heard a two-part question, which is how do you stand out and where do you start? How you stand out, and I love what I heard Kieran and Shannon say, but what my experience has been, folks your age or younger audience thinks they need to be a social media influencer to get a job in the field of marketing and advertising. And I think Kieran hit that well. I think you need to be conscious of how you represent yourself in the digital domain, because that's the first place as a hiring executive or manager that I'm going to look. But for me, it's about if there's a particular field that you're interested in. In other words, if you want to work in social media, reaching, being an expert in Gen Z, then you should very much know what's hot and what's popping in social media for Gen Z. If you want to work in video production and you want to make content, then you should study and know, you should be a student of your craft and know that. So when you have a conversation with someone, you can speak to what inspires you, what motivates you to want to do that work. And I think that's important. If somebody said to me, they want to make commercials, and I say, well, what's your favorite commercial from the last Super Bowl? And they go, I have no idea. Well, that doesn't make sense. Those are the biggest commercials every year that come out. So it's just making sure that you're a student of your craft. And then where to start, I will say, look for inroads into things that exist already that you could become a part of. If you're not familiar, there's a company called Juve Consulting, JUV. Look them up on Instagram at Juve Consulting. And I say that because Juve is a company that we partner with a lot, but it is a Gen Z agency. And it was started by a young man named Ziad Ahmed, who I think I don't know if he's graduated yet, but when I met him a couple of years ago, he was a student at Yale, and he created this consortium of college students across the country to work for big companies and brands and advise them on the Gen Z audience. So look up Juve and see if they're hiring interns or, they're all college students, and they're doing work for companies like Viacom and Unilever and things like that. They just started their own thing. So I do think, in terms of where to start, you'd be surprised where the opportunities actually show up. And Juve is one place to look, and then look for internships. I don't know what's coming up at Joy, but keep an eye out for what's happening there.
Thank you so much. All good advice. With that, I just want to thank our panelists. I am sure that the audience is as inspired as I have been. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom and your expertise. Thank you to everyone who's stayed with us this evening and for all of your great questions. And thank you to everyone at the Center for Communication. We truly appreciate this great conversation. And I encourage everyone, take the panelists up on their offer, get in touch, continue to talk to each other, and let's keep the conversation going.